So you're seeing companies who are traditionally insuring crops like tomatoes and vegetables, et cetera. And they're applying those same types of wordings. And that's what I think is so unique about cannabis in the industry itself. It's not unique at all, in that you still have a plant that's producing a good at the end of the day.
Welcome to The Defense Never Rests with Morgan and Akins, your monthly dose of uncommon sense about all things legal and some that are not.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of The Defense Never Rests. I am your host, Megan Henry, and joined by my co-host, Wendy Smith. Hi, Wendy.
Hi, Megan.
So happy to have you again. And as a theme in my podcast with you, we're talking about drugs again. We're talking about cannabis today. But it's a little bit different. Today we have on Brayden York, who's the manager of risk and insurance at Aurora Cannabis, which is a Canadian company that develops cannabis products, mostly in Canada. But I thought it'd be really interesting to have him come on and talk about, his side of things. We often talk here about the implications of, cannabis use at, in the workers' comp situation or, at work and with general liability associated with it. But on his side, it's a little bit different. So I'm really curious to hear his point of view. And Canada is much different than the United States at this point with regulations. So I think he's going to have a lot to add.
Absolutely.
So with that said, let's bring him in. Good afternoon, Brayden. So happy for you to join us today on the Defense of Arrest. How are you?
I am good. Thank you for having me.
I am super excited to have you today because we're going to talk about, I think a topic that everyone likes to talk about is drugs.
Especially marijuana.
Yes. I mean, that's essentially what we are talking about. But before we jump into that, it is such an interesting background. And I will say you're our first, you're my first guest who works clearly in the cannabis industry. We've talked a lot about it on the podcast with, the implications of, marijuana use in the workplace and from a comp perspective and liability perspective, but we actually haven't had anyone on who's in the industry. So I'm really excited about that. So, thank you for coming on.
Happy to be here.
So for our listeners who don't know, you are the insurance and risk manager at Aurora Cannabis. Now, can you, give us a little bit of background of what Aurora Cannabis does and, essentially what your company does?
Yeah, of course. And before I get in, obviously,
Yes.
the regular disclaimers, the opinions that I express are solely my own and do not express the views or opinions of my employer. So this is just going to be me talking, from my perspective. So Aurora Cannabis is a global medical cannabis producer licensed in Canada. They produce products for both the medical cannabis market, the consumer use cannabis market, and then the global hemp-derived cannabinoid market. So although you do mention drugs, CBD is involved in that, and that is something, as you're aware, is regulated and for sale in the United States. And so that's also an area of the business that the company focuses on. And basically, that's pretty much it. So, you talk about those three main branches of product distribution, and that's kind of where Aurora has focused. Those who may or may not be aware, but cannabis was legalized in Canada in 2018. And through that, there's been, quite a bit of growth in the market as far as stabilization. A lot of people like to say it's mile one or kilometer one of a marathon. Mm-hmm. It's definitely very young in the industry, and you're starting to see that on a global basis, not only in Canada, but internationally, including the United States, where there's a lot of discussion around legalization, but it just hasn't quite happened yet. But for now, Aurora is an established company that operates in Canada.
And super exciting, though, I think, as I would imagine, for you to be in a company that is in such a growing industry at mile one or kilometer one. I mean, you have to have, at least I think I would have this sense of excitement being like, wow, I'm really at the start of something huge and new, and you're at the beginning of it.
Yeah. And I mean, it's interesting because I've actually been involved with cannabis for quite a while. So in Canada, before there was actually legalization on a national basis, there was actually legislation that was set up called MMAR. And it's similar to what kind of regulation you would see in the United States with people who actually do get access to medical cannabis. So when I was an insurance broker prior to joining Aurora, actually, I had experience working with companies who were actually licensed to produce cannabis on behalf of medical patients who were given special access rights for medical use cannabis before it was actually legalized on a national basis. So that was kind of, an interesting involvement I've seen personally, from showing up to clients who had very kind of different operations to now large scale cannabis producers who operate in, say, like Aurora EU GMP certified facilities, which are very much different than what you used to see.
Now, so I wanted to actually get into a little bit of your background, because you were working at a broker before. So tell us a little bit about your career trajectory and how where you started and how you kind of made it over into this world.
Yeah, you bet. So I finished business school, and like many, I wanted to get into software development. And so I was working for a SAP subsidiary doing essentially software for SAP. And it was a Business One integrations consultant, and I hated it. I hated programming all day. I'm not the kind of person that has that personality. So thankfully, my family has properties, and insurance was a big part of that. And so I was curious, and I'm the kind of person that I have a very curious mind. And so at that time, I was just looking for something different, and I had thought I would look into insurance, and I've loved it ever since. And many people say that about insurance. You could say that a lot of people get into it through their parents, et cetera, but I've just really found it a fascinating industry in that it's involved in almost everything you do. I mean, there's every product that's out has some type of insurance implication. Not that it's the be all end all solution to things, but insurance is definitely a big part of a way a lot of companies do business. And so after that, I actually moved to Vancouver. I'm from a small province in a small city in the middle of Canada. And so I moved to Vancouver, Canada, which is a big city, and there's bigger companies there. And so I got an opportunity to kind of work with some of the larger entities. I did try to start my own insurtech company at one point, which was an interesting experience. And then after that, I moved on to Aon Risk Solutions, where I kind of got working in general practice to eventually specialize more in pharmaceutical and work with pharmaceutical companies. And from there, I joined Aurora. And so it was a kind of a nice transition because of all the licensed cannabis companies, when I was looking at Aurora across the spectrum of them, I noticed that there was quite a bit of focus on medical cannabis. And, having had a history in it, I really seen that as where my values aligned. And so of all the companies, I really thought that was a cool opportunity to join Aurora. And here I am 3 years later almost.
So I want to backtrack real quick, because you mentioned that you started your own insurtech company. And so I find that fascinating, just because the insurtech market is huge as well. Yes. And it's another, newer market that's booming. So if you don't mind sharing, like how did that go? I mean, obviously it didn't go great that you're no longer doing it, but maybe you sold your company. I don't know. But, how did you go about starting that?
So I mean, in that case, it was just, I think what everybody experiences and why you see the insurtech market so hot is people are just frustrated. They're frustrated with the way things were, done traditionally, and it's going to change. At that time, we had tried actually, a platform we were trying to start was kind of a LinkedIn, but for buildings. So our kind of concept was that instead of creating a profile for your professional self, you would say create a profile for the buildings that you would insure. Mm-hmm. And underwriters could then just connect directly with those buildings to provide terms and underwrite them that way. So much like a recruiter might use your LinkedIn profile to find you for employment, an underwriter could use your LinkedIn, building profile for offering property insurance. And so it's kind of a concept we had. Unfortunately, just the development and everything didn't work out. And at a certain point, it kind of life moves on. So that's about it.
Well, good for you.
I want to talk about
it, though. Oh, go ahead.
I thought was interesting what you actually said is that your family or families encourage you to go into the insurance industry, because it's sort of like, you think about law, at least in the United States, it's kind of like the opposite. Like most people whose parents go into law, they'll either encourage their kids to go into law or they'll say, don't do it. Pick something else or whatever. So I think that's interesting that you come from a long line of insurance background within your own family.
Well, nobody was really in insurance. It was more of a pain point. Like we paid insurance premiums, and I think it was more like, why are our insurance premiums so high? It was nobody really. I'll say I'm still the one who has to look at the family insurance policies because nobody wants to do it.
Well, and now, I mean, now you like have to, because that is really, you really know what you're looking at. Like, this isn't just like, oh, Brayden kind of knows. Like, you look at insurance policies all the time.
Yes, exactly.
But I do want to touch on how you mentioned, like, talking about the insurance industry, because what you said is something that many of our guests say. So you're not alone when many guests say the insurance industry is super interesting, and a lot of people haven't come from it, and they end up falling into it and staying into it just because the opportunities are so endless. So I at least want you to know, like, you're amongst many others who share your feelings about the insurance industry. At least people who listen to this podcast, I think, would appreciate hearing that again, because it's a very common theme I hear in my seat.
Yeah, definitely.
So with Aurora, though, so I mean, you've been there for a few years now. So how have you, and probably in that time, you've probably seen a extreme amount of growth since you've even started. So what have you witnessed in the change in the cannabis industry since you got in there?
I think a lot of it, just again, speaking broadly, is stabilization. Anybody who really looks at the industry can say there were so many unknowns, right? Market sizing, the types of products, how the black and gray markets would interact with that. Because I mean, the reality is people have been consuming cannabis for decades. It's not like it's new. So these products were out there and they existed, and so. It's been a really interesting evolution to kind of seeing, what happened when the rubber hit the road. I know in Canada, a lot of the talk kind of at the start was that, there was just not enough retail stores because you had all of these producers and such producing the actual cannabis, but then there was nowhere to buy it really. And so you kind of had this situation where you'd have, a bunch of liquor stores in the neighborhood, but there was no cannabis stores. And so there was a little bit of difference there. But I think, a lot of this stuff is just going to take time to work out. And like any natural market, there's going to be a supply demand equation that eventually kind of gets sorted out. And right now, again, we're only a couple of years in. So there's just so much evolution still to occur as far as what that does look like.
Yeah. And I mean, go ahead.
I was just going to say, like, 'cause Canada, you're just saying that, like, it's nationally legal, like you guys, from what I read, didn't come into the U.S. market until about 2020. And have you run into issues, with the U.S. because there's the federal side and then you have the individual states?
Yeah. So, I mean, to be clear, and I mean, just again, speaking from like a personal perspective, like if you look to Aurora, Aurora does not sell like cannabis in the United States with THC. So you would say like the CBD is hemp derived CBD. Those are CBD products, which, under the Farm Bill Act are approved for sale and distribution in the country. And so, I mean, that's kind of something where if you said to look at the United States, it's looked at with an eye of, definite interest there. But I mean, and I don't believe any LPs, at least that I'm aware of, like actually operate in the United States because of the whole federal part of it. There might be subsidiaries of those companies that operate through different types of agreements, but for Aurora specifically, our CBD brand is Reliva, and they work in retail stores. They sell their products there, and it's a good product. So I encourage you to check it out and buy some.
Well, that's what people don't seem to understand too. When they hear about cannabis and the word cannabis or whatever, especially in the United States, they think about, people call it weed, pot, whatever. But there's a store that just opened up the street from my house. I live in the suburbs outside of Philadelphia, and it's they sell different types of products, from oils, massage oils, like things like that with the CBD. And people are like, oh, did you hear about the marijuana store that opened up the street? I'm like, no, they're not selling like illegal drugs. And I think that's kind of like the mentality people have to kind of get out of.
Yeah, definitely. It's, it's one of those things where, like, if you look at the traditional uses for hemp itself, just over, generations, a lot of sales to for ships back in the day, rope, etc. A lot of commercial products were actually made from industrial hemp. And so, if you looked at the way that a lot of the innovation around hemp products, which is a very, in my opinion, a sustainable crop, where you can have, very fast growth cycles compared to trees that might take decades to get to a full cycle. You can have an industrial hemp crop grow in a single season. And so, the application of sustainable products is there for that. And I think that's kind of what they were trying to get at with the Farm Bill in the first place, was to say, like, they do recognize there was an industrial use of this plant, but it gets bunched in with cannabis and marijuana and that whole craze, which is kind of a weird, application of a plant that grows in the dirt. So it's really interesting to see how that stigma has lasted since early generations, and it's still kind of there. And I think it will still take a few decades. But when you do talk to people who are of younger generations, they tend to understand that it isn't all, scare of this product. There's many different uses for it, not only from cannabis side of things, but the hemp side of it as well.
So I think both of you bring up a good point, though. I think some of our listeners might not understand or realize the difference. So if you could, like, what is the difference between, a CBD product and a hemp product and like a marijuana, like a regular marijuana based product? Like, I don't think that's, I don't think I totally know.
Yeah, for sure. So if you look at the cannabis plant and that kind of plant itself, there's over 100 different cannabinoids in the cannabis plant. And so if you look at hemp, which is, traditionally a crop that has lower THC, which is the psychoactive component of the cannabis plant, it's generally good for industrial purposes because it has very strong fibers, et cetera, material, and can be used that. Traditional, marijuana, cannabis is what you would say is what people generally reference, where there's a mix of CBD and higher levels of THC. But that's just two of the hundreds of cannabinoids that are in these plants. And so, a lot of the thought around cannabis has always just been focused on those two main cannabinoids. And then they even break down further. And I think if you look at the United States and even the Farm Bill Act and how they defined it, there's a lot of questions around just even THC and delta H versus delta 9 THC, which are two different cannabinoids. And so you again run into a lot of confusion around those two kind of items. But at the end of the day, it's a plant that has many different properties to it. And some of the properties, like the cannabis that somebody might consume, just so happens to have a psychoactive component to it that can essentially aid in different symptoms that somebody might have. That's pretty much it.
And so, Aurora is really, I think, couched as a pharmaceutical company, right? Because you're it's more, there's more of a medical use to the products provided, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, so you could say that one of the focuses for a company like Aurora is medical. I think if you kind of look at how the market has kind of played out, there's really in the consumer side a point where the consumer base is a little bit different, and then in the medical side, it's people are looking to treat a symptom and pain, and so you have different client bases. It's not that there is not an opportunity for different cannabis companies to approach either market, but if you were to say kind of where there's a big opportunity in the consumer space for cannabis products, it's definitely on the medical side, and that's just because as we've seen globally, there's, say, opioid epidemic, and there's products out there like cannabis that, can supplement some of the symptoms that people feel with a lot less risk than what they are going to be experiencing through products such as opioids, etc.
Yeah.
Well, you just brought up risk, and you're the risk manager. You're the risk manager overseeing all of your brands, like for the whole company, right?
Yes.
So you dabble in different markets, not even just in Canada, but again in the US and in the other global spaces. How do you navigate that?
I think it's different. I mean, you have to. I mean, and again, that's why it's so hard to speak just from a company perspective, and it's because there's just so many people involved there. I mean, if you looked at a company, a lot of the cannabis companies in Canada, we participate in industry associations, and so a lot of that is working with regulators to understand what are those requirements, not only here in Canada, but in, say, the United States, Germany, Israel, etc. A company like Aurora has awesome team members, regulatory teams that, a company like in Canada would deploy is regulated by the government of Canada. So the government of Canada is, essentially setting up the safety, labeling, packaging requirements that a company in Canada who produces the products has to abide by in order to release them to the consumer market. And so when you navigate a lot of these international places, it's good for these countries to see that the Canadian government is managing a lot of the kind of basic requirements around the kind of minimum requirements that need to be met for these products to be released. And so, beyond that, we have, and companies have great government teams that work with the governments to ensure that the products are, meeting the standards necessary to release them to the marketplace. And so it's not necessarily something that is as difficult as it might seem. And it's because, and you'll run into this with the United States, but the government is working, through the frameworks as far as what legalization would look like. And even in this case, I think from the Biden administration, a lot of it has been on medical and decriminalization. And so they might just come out with a framework around that. And that's going to be kind of helpful for consumers when they do start consuming the product to understand that there is a level of safety involved in the consumption process.
Yeah, I mean, that's what stands out to me just is the education aspect. Like even the difference between, as you explained earlier, between hemp and CBD and, traditional marijuana. Like I feel like there's a lack of education to the general public about what the products are, what they do, and the varying degrees of them as well, and what they can be used for and benefit you. And I think some people are like up to their nose in research and know all the details. And then I think there's lots of people who don't know anything.
Yeah, exactly.
So, and of course you're handling, the insurance for, your company for these products. And so, on an international kind of scale. So, in your position, the insurance aspect must be difficult because it's new, or it's a newer avenue to run down. So, what have you found to be some of the challenges that you faced in your position with insurance?
I think a lot of it comes down to just education. And I don't know if it's necessarily unique to cannabis itself. I mean, I ran into this a lot when I was working with pharmaceutical companies, especially around novel drugs. The good kind of part around cannabis is, again, we're regulated by the Canadian government or whatever governments we may sell products by. So there's some level of, pre-underwriting even being done for the insurers themselves. So for Canada, for example, when legalization first happened, only flower was legalized and basically other products like oils. And then it wasn't until later that things like edibles became legal for consumers to have. And so underwriters and insurance kind of had that opportunity to see that it's already being scrutinized quite heavily by the government. and it didn't mean that it wasn't necessarily, but then it came down to an education process. And I think that kind of is a big part of it. And so, for somebody like myself, that involved actually going to London, to Lloyd's of London, and visiting, and with the underwriters, I brought part of my team to help educate the market, because as we're kind of talking about right now, a lot of it's not legal in the United Kingdom. That's where a lot of the insurance capacity comes from. And so it was, our team sitting down and kind of explaining the insurance market to the markets themselves, and helping them understand kind of the products. And a lot of this just comes down to us doing that and then not really expecting much in return. We understand it might take certain underwriters and markets 3, 4, 5 years to get comfortable with cannabis. But because we're taking, somebody like myself takes a really long-term approach to these things, I'm fine with that. I understand that it's going to take that long. And as long as there is enough insurers on board to at least give you at least some capacity, that's helpful.
I've seen from the underwriting side, one of the big challenges, I'm not an insurer, I'm not an underwriter, but things that, I've done and talked about in the past with the cannabis market is that you can't use form policies for this. And I'm sure you've dealt with, novice drugs in the pharmaceutical space. But for cannabis, I don't think you can have just, your typical form policy for this type of market, again, because it is so varied legally. How I said, like, how do you insure a property that is, growing cannabis? I don't think that's the same as, insuring any agricultural property.
Yeah, so I mean, it is and it is. I mean, what's interesting, so if you look at like liability insurance, it's actually a lot of the forms I have read are on life science wording forms, which is interesting. So they've actually just endorsed them with a cannabis component to it. Some of the property insurers are actually, they're mostly agricultural insurers. So you're seeing companies who are traditionally insuring crops like tomatoes and vegetables, et cetera. And they're applying those same types of wordings. And that's what I think so unique about cannabis in the industry itself. It's not unique at all, in that you still have a plant that's producing a good at the end of the day. I think the hardest part for underwriters and such to kind of get around is, one, it's very illegal in many countries around the world, and if you looked at insurance capacity, a lot of that is coming from places like the United States or London, where cannabis isn't legal on, say, a consumer level, or even medical in many cases. So that's obviously the number one. And then the second is going to be the high value of crops. If you look at a single cannabis plant versus a single tomato plant, the cannabis plant is worth a lot more money. And so that's kind of the two different items, but everything else is relatively the same as far as, what you're insuring.
Yeah, I was going to be like, I was just about to jump on that. Like, are we really comparing tomato plants to cannabis plants? Because I think one might have a little bit more security around it because they don't want their plants to get stolen. Whereas I think if one tomato plant goes missing, someone's not going to care.
Well, I think it also goes, how do you control the price point?
Yeah.
On that, that's the difference, on that.
Yeah, and that's still stabilizing, right? And I think, in my true opinion, I think that once cannabis is normalized, it won't really be as much of I need to have guard dogs and all these other crazy things to ensure that it's protected. I mean, even looking at Canada, the requirements for the vaults that cannabis companies have when the regulations first came out versus now is different. I mean, you're talking vaults that were like this thick doors, and for some reason there was this kind of assumption that people were going to be trying to break into these facilities and steal everything. But it never materialized, right? And I think as it becomes more normalized and people are growing plants in their houses and their backyards and et cetera, the level of theft, I don't think will necessarily be there as much. One, there's novelty to the plant itself.
Yeah. It just certainly will take a fair amount of time, I think. And I think we've come a long way. I mean, I think, when you look back at to you know, Northern California when, things started to get more legalized in the United States, I think at first like that there was a lot of criminal behavior going on to protect everyone's product. And I mean, I can't say I'm like I have my ear to the door of what's going on in there, but I certainly feel like you're hearing about it a little bit less now as it's, more normalized. There has to be some challenges you see though between, and we kind of touched on it earlier between the Canadian and the US market, because we're, US is touch and go as to what each state does. It must be, I guess, a little more difficult to manage the regulation of even just the insurance coverage of that when you're going into different markets. That some states it's okay, some states it's not. You just don't really know.
Yeah,
Well, I
and
think
that's very true.
well, you also have in the United States, we face a different issue too, where you've got the federal component, and then you've got the individual states, and how you kind of can navigate the two makes it very hard. And that's actually where a lot of litigation comes out of, at least from what I've seen, had experience with. But you said something interesting, like, when we were talking about like these form, like not using a form policy, or some things can be formed from a liability aspect of it. I mean, how, because you're risk manager, like what you're looking at something globally, how do you account for, on a liability policy for the cannabis?
I mean, it's just like any other company's liability component. I mean, there's going to be a bodily injury and a property, or I guess bodily injury component to most products that you're releasing to the marketplace. And so I think when you think about insurance, it's the last step of the risk management process. So you're going to avoid, control, retain, share, and then you're going to transfer your risk. So there's a much more I guess components to just the simple release a product or come up with a product and then release it to the market. I mean, as I had mentioned, in Canada, there's a ton of requirements before we can even release our product to the marketplace as far as quality assurance goes. As I mentioned, we don't sell cannabis in the United States. So, I mean, for us, that's not really something that we would really be able to navigate or navigating right now. I don't have to personally do that myself. And then when you look, internationally, again, they also have regulations. The government sets protocols, and because, as I noted before, there's QA release and requirements in Canada. Oftentimes it does give other jurisdictions internationally comfort knowing that, the Canadian government has set some pretty strict requirements as far as what kind of product can be released to the marketplace.
Yeah. I have a question for you. So, and I'll just talk about Canada. We don't get into any of the other markets. What about medical? You're selling it on a you're selling medical marijuana. Is there any type of accountability on, intoxication aspect? Like here, and I'll give you an example just to clarify. Somebody who has a medical marijuana card, they're legally allowed to use it, but they work in an industry where they use a lot of machinery, or they're a driver for a company or something like that. That becomes an issue a lot of times, especially with a private employer internally. How do you deal with that, like in the Canadian setting?
I personally don't think there's any difference between cannabis and any other substance that's used to manage, pain or even just be used as a medication in general. I think that, even employers do think about these types of things, there's a level of saying, the CDC has issued tons of guidance around, workplace safety and drug abuse, et cetera, that might be applied. And I think that those same rules would imply for intoxication or substance use from cannabis versus anything else. And it's really, portable to those other items. So if you don't want employees, taking, an opioid or something in operating machinery, you can apply the same policy to cannabis as far as it being added to that item. Or if I'm, say running a company, that's just something that needs to be factored into what kind of risk tolerance they have around that. And as a lot of employers learn, sometimes it's just it's an on-the-job learning. I mean, you have losses, you have to look at the losses, what are the results of those losses, and then from there you can set policies and learnings around what may and may not be accessible use for operating things like machinery. Just go from there.
So one thing I'm curious about is, obviously as cannabis and marijuana gets legalized, I mean, it's already legal in Canada, but in the United States, like you have a lot of like small personal people who are trying to develop their own products like themselves and sell them. And, I feel like that is where, at least in my opinion, that's where a lot of the trouble comes, because there's no regulation for that. If someone just like has their little side business and they're, making whatever they're making in their kitchen and then, then selling it to others. Like, and I feel like that's where there's a lot of risk. And obviously those individuals are likely not insured. And at least in a company like Aurora or other companies similar to it, like you have to follow specific regulations, like just like a standard pharmaceutical company that, the products going out there, they have to have X amount of, THC and it's labeled, and have your clear regulations attached to it. I think a lot of people get confused because they compare that to the home person who's, making, marijuana butter in their kitchen and then selling it, wherever they sell it. I don't know, but I'm sure they do. But I feel like that's where a lot of the bad rap gets, that there's the potential danger, because the danger really is more associated likely where there's not the regulations attached.
Yeah, and that's exactly it, right? And so that's where you can kind of say, what is the benefit to having it legalized with regulations in place? And so when you look at it, and that's the reality behind why maybe even a gray and black market still does exist. So in Canada, we're obviously regulated to sell those products, but for an edible, for example, you can't sell an edible that has more than 10 milligrams of THC in it right now. And so in the United States, you can cross the border, or even go to the gray market and buy a product with 100 milligrams of THC in it. That's maybe even similar price. Yeah. But the difference between that is, as a Canadian LP, if you're buying from one, that your product's been tested for pesticides, etc., to ensure that it is the quality that you would, be able to at least rely upon as a consumer, based on what Health Canada's kind of laid out. And so I think, what's interesting is that somebody who's maybe newer to the market or trying products for the first time from a legalized, trusted source, is that you can have a little bit of certainty knowing that it wasn't just whipped up in somebody's kitchen and you don't know where they got it from. And so that's kind of, I think, the sides and why people are really excited about cannabis being legalized, because there is that reliability in markets where the government is taking that stance. Well, however it looks in the United States eventually, I'm not sure. Obviously, I don't think anybody really knows at this point. But I can say, like, if you came to Canada and you walked into a cannabis store to buy consumer recreational product, you could have some certainty that there was good quality control going into that product being released.
Yeah, and it's almost like, I mean, I don't think any of us were around during this time, but like when alcohol wasn't as regulated, people were making like moonshine, in their toilets or whatever they were doing, or their bathtubs.
I think not the bathtub. I don't think it was the toilet.
I don't know. Sounded bad. I mean, it's more contained. I don't know, but you know what I mean? Like there's
more risk of flushing it down the toilet. That's what they didn't want.
Well, but I mean, there's regulation even in the alcohol industry. The bottles have to be labeled. There has to be ingredients. Like I think there is comfort in knowing that there are checks and balances before you use or buy and then use a product. However, it's probably like it's much more expensive because you have to pay for, there has to be with checks and balances, you have to pay people to do those checks and balances. And I think that's probably in my eyes, that's a view of, or that is an issue too, because people are always going to want to get things cheaper and like, well, I don't want to pay, X amount at the store. I can go on the, the black market or gray market and get it cheaper. You just don't know what you're getting. But then if something happens, there's no insurance.
And that's going to exist. Yeah. But that's for all products, right? Like, I mean, you can go buy a knockoff Rolex or a knockoff purse or, whatever thing online or at a market in the middle of nowhere. I mean, it's not unique to, I would say, like the cannabis industry to have that type of concern. And so, I mean, there's always going to be consumers who will go that route, and that's, I think, risk that they end up taking.
Yeah,
I've never heard that analogy before, like a knockoff Rolex to what would be a knockoff cannabis product?
What?
Well, I think just going to a store in the United States now, for example. So I mean, you again have a federally illegal product, so you're then looking at your state regulation to say what that entails. If you were to buy a cannabis product from a state in which maybe it wasn't legal, that is a knockoff, really. And so you're not knowing where the plant came from, what type of testing was done before that plant was produced into a certain product, and then you're consuming it. So I mean, that is really what it would be.
Yeah. So one thing that comes up, or it's come up a few times on this podcast when we talk about cannabis, though, and is, and you may not be able to speak to this or not, but, when you have someone who's, either in Canada, you could regardless of where you live, you can use cannabis products. But if you have someone who's working and they're injured on the job, either they're taking medical marijuana or they've purchased legal marijuana or whatever it may be, the impact on that workplace injury, if that happened while they were taking that product, I know that's not exactly what you do, but I'm sure you probably have your ear to the door a little bit more than we do in Canada. But what are you seeing as the implications of that? Is it like taking Advil on while you're working, or is it a little bit different?
There is guidance around substances in the workforce. And, where I again personally try to guide people to think about this is treating it like any other substance that you might have. So, for example, there's rules that say you shouldn't consume and drive. So if you're a person who needs to be driving, it's not exactly something that you can consume and then complete your job. So you'd have to figure out whether or not there's a substance that you could substitute with that might not have that same impact on you. And so, that's just one example, but I think it generally would apply to any type of substance that you may use to treat an injury or pain, or even alcohol, right? There's a rule around whether or not you can have a pint at lunchtime and go back to work. I think certain companies will come up with certain policies based on their level of comfort. But at the end of the day, I wouldn't say that it should be treated anything unique compared to any level of impairment with any level of drug that may be result. Like if you're taking some type of medication, any type of pharmaceutical, and there's side effects to it, you should be aware of those side effects and ensure that, you can or cannot do your job while consuming.
I feel like it's like people need some time to catch up in a way too. Like there's and also I think it helps to start looking at it from a more medical pharmaceutical perspective rather than a like black market drug perspective. But I think that's going to take a lot of time. But I mean it's true. Like you take all like whatever medication you like, say you get your wisdom teeth out, you can't drive your butt home after you get your wisdom teeth out. Like there's no driving after that, or any sort of medication. It says you don't operate heavy machinery, but I think people don't have that same, or general population is not thinking like that. They don't think of it the same way yet. I think it just we have some evolution to go through before we get there.
I
Yeah,
think
and
it comes
it's
down to regulation. It definitely
yeah,
does, because you just said in Canada, you said like it's 10 milligrams,
that's for
right? Edibles.
edibles
Yeah, I think it's harder
for an
here in the
edible
US.
product.
Yeah, I think it's harder here because not everybody is taking the same thing. You're not getting it from one source. It's not government regulated necessarily. So it might not be 10 milligrams. And I think that's sort of where we, employers run into issues, here, especially like I use a company that does machinery, we operate a lot of machinery. They don't allow drug use. They even say in their policies, you're subject to, uh, you know, uh, drug testing, a random drug test, at any given time. It's in their employee handbook. And then you get, there's a state where, they've made marijuana use, medical marijuana use legal. They get tested and they're going to test positive. Whether they're doing it at work or they're just doing it at home. And that's where you're seeing a lot of the litigation end of it. But again, that comes from, I get what you're saying about like the intoxication and any type of drug. Like you don't want somebody using Oxycontin, hyped up on Oxycontin or Valium or anything like that, operating the same piece of, that type of equipment.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And I think eventually people will just realize like it's just another substance. I mean, you should treat it very similar, and the same rules apply in Canada. I mean, I've worked with mining companies, and I have friends who are engineers or people who work in camps. It's such, and they have dry camp rules. Even though cannabis is legal in Canada, it doesn't just apply to it applies to alcohol, it applies to other things, and companies have found that just giving a blanket statement to substances, not necessarily highlighting that cannabis is any different, just saying this is now something on this substance list that needs to be monitored, and you will be, say, even tested, or you just can't consume it. And that's kind of the line that a lot of companies have taken.
Yeah.
I'm going to pick your insurance out of your brain, Brayden. So in Canada, as I'm not, I don't practice in Canada. Do insurance companies, when you're paying for, legalized medical marijuana, is there like a medical coding, like a certain amount that they pay a bill? So if somebody says, hey, I got my medical marijuana. This is, insurance company. I need you to reimburse. Do you have that there?
Yep, exactly. So, I mean, it really depends on the insurer that you have. So, I would say like our company has an insurance provider, and they're one of a couple in Canada that actually do reimburse for medical cannabis. And similar to any other, depending on the tier that you're in, A, B, or C, there's going to be a different deductible amount. So you're getting reimbursed either 80, 90, or 100%. And you file it no different than filing a dental claim. It's very, very much the same. I mean, or a claim for any other drug that you might be using, just as far as a prescription. And it works the exact same. So it's kind of actually nice how easy they've been able to transition that as just another item on the list of things you can get reimbursed for.
Although Canada has always been ahead of the game with its prescriptions and healthcare than the US, I will say. You have a leg or two up on us, I think. A little more progressive. But what, sitting in your shoes and seeing that where things have progressed since you got into this industry and where things are now, I mean, what do you think we're going to be seeing in 5 to 10 years? Like how many more changes are we going to see?
Yeah, I think a lot more normalization, right? I mean, I still think that it's looked at as a taboo topic, and I think eventually people will just treat it much similar to other things that they might consume. Like I would say, personally, it's still a little bit weird if you are out about with friends and somebody's drinking a beer and somebody pulls out, say, a cannabis joint and smokes it, there's still a stigma around that, although both are just as legal. We've been ingrained over the decades that both are not equalized, and it will take decades for people to just pull it out. But having traveled internationally quite a bit, it's interesting in that in a lot of cultures, they do treat it very normal. It's I've had a privilege of, say, even traveling with people from Israel, etc. And when they consume cannabis, it's very much part of their identity and who they are, and it doesn't have that stigma. That was maybe the group I was with, but I think eventually you'll get to that point where people just don't treat it with a stigma, and it just takes time. And from an insurance side of things, that's exactly it as well. So we might talk about how I would work with insurers on this exact same topic. And a lot of it's just bringing them to our facilities. I mean, I always have an open invite with my insurers to come see our sites. And I've toured tons of them through our sites to just show them how normal this is. And it's actually helped create really strong relationships. So, bringing them to our facility, showing them that this is very much similar to a pharmaceutical or an agriculture operation that they might have seen. They have to gown up, they have to gown down. They can't just walk in and pull something off. Like, there's security, there's very much of official, operating business behind these things. And when they see that, they're like, wow, this is not what I expected to see. But it's part of the conversations that they take time to develop, and it's just one of these things where over time, as these conversations happen and as people kind of start to realize that this is normal, it will eventually get there.
And I mean, I love that, because I think that you explaining what your facility is like, I think is probably the best sales pitch to an insurer. Be like, look at our operation. Like, this is not homegrown. Like, we are very official. This is very, like, I even picture like very sterile. Like, we treat it as like almost a medical facility. And that has to, anyone who's on any insurers on, or any insurers on the fence to come see that, be like, oh, okay, like this is not like what the misconception we might have in our head.
Yeah, and it's honestly been 10 out of 10 times where you have an insurer or somebody come to the facility, and then they really actually, it clicks. Like, they understand that this isn't a fly-by-night operation. I mean, you show up to some of these facilities and they're very, very, very sophisticated operations, and you actually kind of get this sense of hope and trust and everything when you see these sites, to say like, oh wow, okay, like this is actually a legitimate industry, and I think there's something here, and I think that's why investors are so excited about the future of cannabis, at least at a scale that Canada's been able to develop.
Yeah, and I think it's here, like I think it's happening in the US. I just think we're a ways behind because of the lack of the federal aspect of it. But I think like states that are doing it, they're doing it. I just think it's just not on a national scale.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm sure there's probably some very good operators in the States. I don't know what the requirements are around that. I mean, we don't have any facilities down there, but I think as with anything, you'll have maybe a couple of bad operators here or there, and that's from an underwriting standpoint, it's about getting out and seeing it. I've had insurance engineers at every single one of my cannabis production facilities, and it's just to show them how legitimate these operations are, and that if they're looking at their portfolio of risk, for them to have something to benchmark against, and oftentimes it's our facilities.
Yeah.
Do you ever get asked about, from, because when we look at key insurance industry concerns surrounding cannabis here in the United States, they look at the impact of accident frequency, potential coverage mandates, again, because you got the federal side and you have the states, and then, issues that arise with like having workers' compensation insurance and having adequate coverage on that. How have you dealt with that?
I mean, I think it just varies all the time. Like, I mean, even for example, the U.S. CBD operations that we do have, we have to work with the state by state on requirements. It's actually been quite unique with COVID as well, because you have employees who are now in states move to their states, and so they're operating from there, but their place of employment is in a different state, and so it's really just working with whoever to understand whatever the requirements are, and you're just doing the right thing ultimately. I mean, as an individual, that's all you can really do, is just try to understand what is the right thing to do in this situation, and then you just have to work with whatever stakeholder it might be to make sure that they're getting what they need.
Yeah. So we're just about out of time, but I wanted to make sure we touched on this because you mentioned your travels, and I'm curious. You said in Israel it was, it was very accepted to, drink a beer and consume a cannabis product at the same place. But what, during your travels, where have you found is it the most openly accepted, place to consume cannabis out in the open without any stigma?
Besides Amsterdam?
Yeah, besides Amsterdam.
Yeah.
We all know, forget Amsterdam. You can do a lot of things in Amsterdam that are not acceptable in other places.
I'm not going to go there.
Yeah, that Amsterdam is definitely. Yeah. Well, I mean, I wouldn't say so. It wasn't in Israel. I was actually traveling, just in meeting Israeli people internationally. I found that very, very open to that. Colombia was maybe one place that I found was quite, people just, there's a country that has a really bad stigma around it, but one of their biggest exports is flowers. And so I was down there for Mir de Flores, which is one of their big flower festival that they have, because it's such a big industry for them. And people just they like to enjoy it, and it's maybe a little bit normalized from that side of things. But I can say, having been in Europe and Southeast Asia and South America, that you can find places of pockets. Obviously, you have to be careful as far as not doing anything illegal, and I do obviously never recommend it, but people do in these places, when you are there, they do consume, and you can see it when they do happen. Obviously, because it is legal in Canada, that's where I would recommend people do come and try cannabis there. Obviously, it is legal in some states on state level, but not federal level. So I won't comment on that. Yeah. But yes, in that would be kind of, wherever you go, there is going to be groups of people, generally in the younger generations, that just don't have the same belief around cannabis use as some of the older generations do.
And do you think, I mean, I know it's this way in Amsterdam, but do you think it's going to eventually evolve? And maybe it's this way in Canada, I don't know, but evolve to be like you're at, a local bar or restaurant, and you're able to purchase a cannabis product right along with purchasing a glass of wine?
I would hope so. I mean, I think there's still going to be that maybe the issues with smoke inhalation, where you would have, people still having to go outside. And so there being some type of consumption side to that. Edibles and cooking with edibles is, I think, an interesting one, because, you can make a lot of products from regular, meat to desserts to just snacks with cannabis. And so I think there'll be those markets in developing. It's just about, as with anything, making sure that there's a consumer base to actually make those types of ventures profitable. And it will slowly get there. I truly do believe that over time, it's the industry's so young as far as cannabis being an acceptable product. You're seeing obviously Canada, Uruguay is one of the countries that's kind of opening it up, from medical and recreational side. Obviously, Amsterdam has that same type of opportunity, and then the medical markets will grow. Germany's talking about it. The US is obviously talking about it. The times are changing, and I think it's for the benefit of not just people from a medical side, but just the general use of the cannabis plant, whether it be in a form of cannabis or hemp, for just general consumer products.
Yeah, it is
there's a
funny.
big business side to it,
Oh my God.
Yes.
especially taxes. And that's
Yeah.
where you're seeing a lot of states warm up, is not just because they're thinking of regulations and the consumer use, but I mean, from a tax perspective, they get a lot of, states get a lot of revenue
Yeah.
from that and controlling that.
Yes.
And the restaurant thing I think is interesting because I do feel like there's going to be like this whole cannabis based restaurant thing happening. Like I mean I force, like, I think there's just so many people out there who experiment with it. They're going to figure out how to make things taste really good.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, the hard part you'll always find with cannabis is that it interacts with everybody's bodies differently. And so, you might have four people sitting at a table and everybody tries the same amount and the same bite, and everybody will have a different experience.
Yeah.
And so that's, I think, always going to be the trouble with things like food and just consumption in general. And so, I mean, whether you try for the first time in the future, I would say low and slow is kind of the motto. I mean,
Yeah.
it's never good to jump off the jump off the deep end and just not know. As with anything, right? You want to consume responsibly, and I think that's the way to do it when you are doing it. Just knowing that it's something that is going to have an impact on your body, and you just don't know.
Yeah.
And so it's always safer to go low and slow.
Low and slow is a very good motto. I like it. Well, Brayden, thank you so much for joining us today. I appreciate you indulging my, or at least my naive point of view about everything that's going on in the world of cannabis. I will be the first to admit I'm pretty naive about it, but thank you for enlightening me and our listeners. I appreciate it. So, and for our listeners, if you like what you hear, you can always like and subscribe to The Defense of Arrests on Apple Podcasts. And new in 2022, you can find us on YouTube at The Defense of Arrests.